please. We'll begin the day routine presenting reading petitions. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition to the Nova Scotia Government re video lottery terminals. And the operative clause reads, therefore, we respectfully request the government of the province, 1, to ban video lottery terminals or at least curtail their use, and 2, to ensure that staff members in every school in the province be given training that will enable them to make use of the relevant curriculum materials to the end that the harm done by gambling may be reduced. And Mr. Speaker, this has been signed by 37 residents of my riding, and I too have affixed my signature.
Petitions table. Honourable member for Colchester Muscat Alba Valley.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition from some over 400 constituents. And the prayer is, we, the undersigned, object to the decision by the Department of Environment and Labour to grant an approval to Inglewood Farms, Jeff Cutton, to spread sludge on farmland in Lower Truro, Colchester County, and petition Colchester County Council to take the necessary steps to ensure that this does not happen. Mr. Speaker, and I sign my name to the petition.
Petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm reading this on behalf of the Minister of Education. Speaker, I give notice on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas every year during Education Week, we recognize the work of teachers and others who are dedicated to educating young Nova Scotians. And whereas this year we are highlighting how our teachers are using fun, hands-on activities to help all of our students develop their scientific literary skills. And whereas we are supporting our educators in these activities by working with them to implement our world-class science curriculum and providing new science teaching resources. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize our teachers' efforts to ensure our students always question, investigate, and discover through scientific education. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice, and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas one lucky Nova Scotia schools music students were the recipients of a Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences Band-Aid program grant of $10,000 to buy new instruments. And whereas Sydney Academy was one of only 11 schools in Canada to receive the financial boost to its music program, and whereas not only were the students thrilled to receive the grant, but they had the added bonus of having Canada's Nickelback band members in town to help them celebrate and offer the students advice and encouragement prior to the band's Sydney concert date in March. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the students and teachers of Sydney Academy on the receipt of this needed injection of funds to its music program and wish them well as they continue their courtesy of Karis and Nickelback. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in January, HMCS Toronto and its 240-person crew departed from Halifax Harbour to join a U.S.-led group of ships to monitor the Persian Gulf in the continuing battle against the ever-present threat of terrorism. And whereas there are another 32 personnel deployed from Maritime Forces Atlantic, currently serving in various locations, including those that just recently left our coast for international intervention action in Haiti, and those on UN duty in Afghanistan, Alert, Bosnia, Florida, Golan Heights, Persian Gulf, Sierra Leone, and whereas the valiant commitment that our troops dedicate to their job each day, sadly highlighted with the losses our Canadian military has suffered in the last few years, is evident wherever they find themselves on duty. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House salute the continuing efforts of these brave men and women of Maritime Forces Atlantic, with special thoughts to those currently serving our country in conflict areas in the name of democratic freedom. We thank them and we thank their families for their sacrifice of the time spent apart. And, Mr. Speaker, I move waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a survey of tourism industry experts by National Geographic's Traveling Magazine has given Cape Breton an exceptionally high mark. Whereas the magazine, in doing this kind of poll for the first time with 200 tourism experts, scored Cape Breton at 78 points, tied for second with 2 other world-class locations, and finishing behind only the Norwegian fjords, which placed first with 82 points. Whereas Cape Breton placed ahead of such historic tourism destinations such as Hawaii, the Grand Canyon, Australia's Great Barrier Reef, the Great Wall of China, the Scottish Highlands, as well as other Canadian destinations such as the Rocky Mountains. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs of this House applaud the efforts of people such as Sandra McDonald, Executive Director of Destination Cape Breton, along with others involved in the tourism industry in Cape Breton, for making such an amazing score possible while working to bring the world to Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ocean Nutrition Canada has undergone a $10 million expansion to their Mulgrave processing plant, and whereas Ocean Nutrition is the owner of a unique technology that makes it the world's leading producer of healthful, high-quality fish oil supplements and powders for the food industry, and whereas Ocean Nutrition is an innovator in taking natural resources such as fish from the sea and turning them into completely new products to earn export dollars and provide hundreds of jobs, particularly in rural Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that in appreciation of our shared concern for health promotion, rural growth and economic development, all members of this House congratulate Ocean Nutrition and their Mulgrave operation and thank them for their dedication to good health and well-being of all Nova Scotians. I respectfully request waiver of notice, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 10 years, Canada's 50 Best Managed Companies Awards have been celebrated homegrown, world-class success stories, and whereas 2 Nova Scotia companies have been named to this prestigious list for 2003, 2004, IMP Group International and Secunda Marine International, whereas the management of these 2 companies have demonstrated exceptional ability and aptitude in all areas of management and best business practices. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House join me in congratulating IMP owner Ken Rowe and Secunda Marine owner Freddie Smithers on having their companies named among Canada's 50 best managed companies and wish them much success in their future business endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I respectfully request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Set Criteria for Prioritizing Road Improvement Projects.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Set Criteria for Prioritizing Road Improvement Projects.
Give these to the other parties. Bill 52, entitled An Act to Set Criteria for Prioritizing Road Improvement Projects.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cole Harbour Rural Heritage Society was formed in 1973 to preserve the natural and cultural history of Cole Harbour and surrounding areas. And whereas on March 29th, the Society held its annual general meeting where honorary memberships were awarded to individuals who have been longtime friends and contributors of the Society. And whereas the 2004 recipients of honorary memberships are Donald Harris, Melvin Harris, and Lloyd Eisner, who as lifelong residents of Cole Harbour have used their talents and resources to enhance the growth and well-being of the Society. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Donald Harris, Melvin Harris, and Lloyd Eisner on receiving honorary memberships in the Cole Harbour Rural Heritage Society and commend them for their hard work and commitment to the community of Cole Harbour. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Reverend Father John G. Webb, a recipient of the Order of Canada, is being honored with the establishment of a $1,500 scholarship for a student graduating from the University College of Cape Breton, and whereas Father Webb is a pioneer in the area of social work and is known for the establishment of Talbot House, a residential addiction treatment facility for men in 1955, and whereas this scholarship will enable graduate students to pursue a degree in social work. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Legislature of the Province of Nova Scotia honor the establishment of the Reverend John G. Webb Scholarship at the University College of Cape Breton and recognize the contribution of Father Webb to the field of social work. I would ask for passage.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Woods Harbor Volunteer Fire Department recently held their annual banquet, and whereas firefighters in Woods Harbor asked if I would come and bring greetings from the province, and whereas during this banquet, while I have been told it is used frequently at many fire departments' banquet, I heard the fireman's prayer for the first time, which in 5 verses covers everything from being paged out to being alert at all times to asking God to look after one's family if the worst should transpire at a call. Therefore, it be resolved, MLAs in this House of Assembly recognize the fireman's prayer this afternoon as thought-provoking and encouragement for volunteer firefighters in Shelburne County and across Nova Scotia who are asked to put their lives at risk at any given time of day or night. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour, Easter Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Michael Hewitt emigrated from the United Kingdom to pursue a career in Canada as a nurse in the Northwest Territories and became the Deputy Minister of Justice in the Territory before retiring and moving to Nova Scotia. Whereas Michael Hewitt, after the Westray accident, used his excellent skills as a facilitator in the mid-1990s to bring labour and management together in the development of new mine safety regulations and a new Occupational Health and Safety Act. Whereas after the Occupational Health and Safety Act was passed by this Assembly, Michael Hewitt became the first chairperson of the newly created Occupational Health and Safety Appeal Panel, a job he held until his recent retirement. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize the contributions of Michael Hewitt to workplace health and safety in Nova Scotia and labour management relations in our province, and wish him and his family all the best in the years to come, and I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Waivers. Is agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester Muscatella Valley on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a former colleague of mine that used to be on Halifax County Council as well, a provincial legislature, and once again a Halifax Region Municipal Councillor, and that would be Mr. David Hensby.
Certainly welcome Mr. Hensby to the gallery today. The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Students Against Drunk Driving is a youth-led, non-profit organization created to stop alcohol and drug-related automobile deaths. And whereas Northeast Kings Education Centre student Daisy Day has helped lead the way in strengthening the efforts of SAD at her school. And whereas the popular grade 12 student is working with the local chapter of Mothers Against Drunk Driving to develop a fundraising and awareness campaign as well as a special project for May. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House recognize the efforts of Daisy Day and all the members of Students Against Drunk Driving at the Northeast Kings Education Centre and wish them much success in their important work. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waivers. Is agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas route number 4, extending from Sydney to Port Hawkesbury, is a vital link to the eastern Cape Breton island, and whereas the economic and social viability of Richmond County and Cape Breton Regional Municipality is directly related to the quality of route number 4, and whereas today the Department of Transportation and Communications has authorized a call to tender for the upgrade of a further 3 kilometers of route number 4 extending from Big Pond Center to Middle Cape in the Cape Breton Regional Municipality. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the efforts of the Minister of Transportation and Public Works for responding positively to the concerns raised by the residents of Cape Breton Regional Municipality over the deplorable state of route number 4. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the World Women's Hockey Championship Games were recently held in Nova Scotia in locations around the province, and whereas the East Hants Sportsplex acted as host rink for the Swedish and Chinese teams, whereas there was a great cultural exchange between the community and the teams, most notably the Swedish team, which took the time to visit local schools. Therefore, be resolved this House of Assembly congratulate the organizers, staff, and fans of the East Hants Sportsplex, as well as the Chinese and Swedish World Women's Hockey teams on their successful event, and I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas February is dedicated as Heart and Stroke Month, with many volunteers working to raise funds and awareness across Nova Scotia, and whereas Cheryl Walker of Halifax has served as program coordinator, organizing the door-to-door canvassers for all of Bedford, Halifax, and the western half of Halifax County, and whereas this is an extremely large area which requires a great deal of commitment and organization, therefore be it resolved the members of the House congratulate Cheryl Walker and the many volunteers who gave countless hours to make this year's Heart and Stroke campaign a success. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough Shea Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas with the enactment of the County Incorporation Act in 1879 by this Nova Scotia legislature, the District of St. Mary's was reorganized as the Municipality of St. Mary's. And whereas John A. Kirk was unanimously chosen as the first warden at the council meeting held at the Sherbrooke Courthouse on Tuesday, January 13th, 1880. And whereas today the people of the municipality of the District of St. Mary's are ably represented by Warden Milton Jordan, Deputy Warden David Clark, and Councillor Donald Dunbar, Elizabeth Fleet, Fred Jack, Jacqueline Dort, and Jim Harple. Therefore be it resolved that the members of this House join me in recognizing the 125th anniversary of this municipality of St. Mary's and extend our best wishes to all those who work and reside in this beautiful Nova Scotia community. I ask for waiver.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Shabakto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a significant event occurred this year in high school basketball in the province when both the St. Pat's High School Division I boys and Division I girls teams won the provincial titles on March 6th. And whereas the Irish boys, coached by Irvin Carvery, won their second consecutive championship, a feat which has not happened since 1988. And whereas the Irish girls, coached by Rachel Ross and assistant coach Gail Rice, won the school's first Division I girls title since 1977. Therefore, be it resolved that this House extend congratulations to the St. Pat's Irish boys basketball team, Coach Irvin Carvery, and the St. Pat's Irish girls basketball team, Coach Rachel Ross and assistant coach Gail Rice, and to their families and fans for a successful season and well-deserved championship wins. I seek waiver of notice passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since February of 1980, the Eastern Shore Ground Search and Rescue has been highly committed to the safety and well-being of residents of Nova Scotia's Eastern Shore. And whereas in order to fulfill this commitment to dedication, volunteers on February the 29th, 2004, held their grand opening of their new headquarters at the Big Blue Barn. And whereas having a permanent home in the Head of Chesuncook will provide a stable base for this much-needed organization, Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate Eastern Shore Ground Search and Rescue on the opening of their new headquarters and the outstanding work they do in all our communities. And I'd ask for waiver.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Elaine Cherie Young was recently the first female ever elected to the position of captain in the Blandford Fire Department, and whereas when it comes to helping people, it seems as if Elaine Young doesn't have any limitations because she's also a highly qualified first responder, a registered nurse, and a member of the Hubbards Fire Department. And whereas Ms. Young is a resident of Birchie Head, Nunavut County, where she spends some of her time when not assisting others in need of help. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs applaud the significant achievements of Elaine Cherie Young and wish her every success in all her endeavors, including the most recent one as an executive member of the Blandford Fire Department. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Pictou County recently lost one of its best-known musicians and composers with the death of Edna May Peppard at the age of 93, and whereas Edna Peppard was involved in music her whole life as choir member, organist, and accompaniment for fiddlers, and whereas Edna composed a number of waltzes, songs, and hymns that were recently compiled into a book called My Tunes, and her Christmas hymn, Follow the Star, is sung in many area churches. Therefore, be it resolved that this legislature recognize the important contribution paid by Edna May Peppard in the musical and family life of Pictou County. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of motion and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the heroes of community service in this province are volunteers who give of their time, energy, and resources to do what they can to make life better for others. And whereas it is volunteers that made it possible for the United Way of Cumberland County to just recently complete its most successful year to date, surpassing a goal of $140,000. And whereas President Gary Cormier attributed to the success of the Cumberland County United Way through the tireless efforts of a group of volunteers whom he termed the secret of our success. Therefore, be it resolved that this House acknowledge the contribution made by volunteers from one end of this province to the other, and especially to those who did so much in the past year for the Cumberland County United Way. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Colchester Historical Society recently recognized 4 individuals who have demonstrated a significant desire to explore and expand the history of the Colchester County, and whereas Howard Van Allen received the Historical Heritage Award for his exceptional contributions to the area by spearheading the efforts to establish a Brule Fossil Museum. And whereas in 1994, Mr. Van Allen discovered 290 million-year-old world-class fossils in Brule and proceeded to spend almost 10 years working towards his goal of having a place to display them in the area. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Howard Van Allen on receiving the Colchester Historical Society Heritage Award and express our appreciation for his efforts to preserve the history of Colchester County. Mr. Speaker, I request waivers.
For waivers, is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas John Martin School, in conjunction with Carson Mosier, Andre Pascar, 4Cs Foundation, and Graham McPherson and the Entrepreneurial Project members engaged in students in an evening of art for peace on Thursday, March the 25th, 2004. And whereas its theme of the evening, Hands Together for Peace, depicted artistic venues in mural arts, folk art, caricatures, photography, photography, I should say, music, dance, and acting. And whereas the performers and artists were students of John Martin School, and they unleashed their hidden talents for all to see at this special event. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the students and the sponsors involved in the Arts for Peace program and recognize that John Martin School's involvement with peace is in keeping with Canada's international reputation as a peacekeeping nation. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion's carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Registered Professional Foresters Association of Nova Scotia and the Forest Technicians Association of Nova Scotia inducted their first 3 members into the Nova Scotia Forestry Hall of Fame, and whereas the 3 inductees are Dr. Wilfred Creighton, Dr. Douglas Embry, and Les Corkum, and whereas Dr. Creighton was Nova Scotia's first provincial forester and later Deputy Minister of Lands and Forest, and Dr. Embry was a researcher with the Canadian Forestry Service, and Les Corkum, a forest technician who was instrumental in designing a system used to fight forest fires. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Dr. Creighton, Dr. Embry, and Les Corkum for their years of service and hard work, along with their induction as the first recipients of the Nova Scotia Forestry Hall of Fame. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Yes. Whereas after more than a decade of strong leadership, Donnie Hale recently retired as the fire chief for the town of Westville. And whereas following a lengthy interview process and interest shown by 10 applicants, Sandy McIntosh has been selected by the Westville Town Council as the town's new fire chief. And whereas Doug Oliver was chosen as the department's new deputy chief by the Westville Town Council. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs in the House of Assembly commend the achievements of retired Chief Hale while wishing new Fire Chief McIntosh and new Deputy Chief Oliver the very best in their new challenges. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 22nd is Earth Day all over the world, and whereas the Whitney Pier Youth Club held its 9th annual Earth Day celebration on Saturday, April the 17th, and whereas many youth and their parents took part in the celebrations by cleaning up the garden, recycling T-shirts with tie-dye, and participating in games and a barbecue. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislature recognize and applaud the youth, parents, staff who participated in the 9th annual Earth Day celebrations at the Whitney Pier Youth Club and for making the annual event success that it is. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Woman's Place Resource Centre has moved from Lawrencetown to a large and more accommodating space in Cornwallis Park, the centre services the areas of Annapolis, Kings, and Digby counties. Whereas due to ongoing and expanding projects resulted in this move to better serve the clients of these areas. Whereas the center has been in operation since 1991. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Woman's Place Resource Center for their recent move, along with their hard work and dedication to helping women in Annapolis, Kings, and Digby counties. Mr. Speaker, I hereby ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Eastern Shore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Dalhousie Tigers recently came away with a women's school record at the Canadian Inter-University Sport Indoor Track and Field Championship held in Windsor, Ontario, and whereas leading the charge at the tournament was East Jador's Adriana Power, And whereas Miss Power captured gold in the 60 and 300 meters events, shattering provincial records in the process. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House join me in congratulating Adriana Power on her outstanding showing at this year's Canadian Inter-University Sport Indoor Track and Field Championship, and wish her much success in her future athletic and academic endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I request the waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas any number of speed demons in Lower Sackville breathed a sigh of relief after last Wednesday, April 15th, when Radar Ray worked his last shift as an RCMP officer in the Lower Sackville Detachment. Whereas over his career, Sergeant Ray Russell has issued over an estimated 30,000 speeding tickets. And whereas Sergeant Russell has served his detachment, his community, and his country well as a dedicated police officer, as a choir member in his church, as an Olympic-level boxing referee, and as a member of the United Nations peacekeeping missions in war-torn Bosnia and Kosovo in 1999 and 2000. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Sergeant Ray Russell on his 36-year career as a dedicated police officer and wish him and his wife Rita a successful retirement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas shelters filled to capacity and 300 homeless on the streets of Halifax alone provide irrefutable proof that there is an affordable housing crisis in this province. Whereas in the first 18 months of an affordable housing agreement with the federal government, this government has constructed a grand total of 15 units in the Valley and authorized another 6 in Halifax that will be sold to families earning $50,000 per year. And whereas this government's answer to homelessness in Halifax during one of the worst winters in decades was to turn people out of abandoned buildings where they were trying to shelter from snow and high winds, rather to address their need for affordable housing. Therefore, be it resolved, this government realize they have an obligation to all Nova Scotians, not just those who earn $50,000 or more, and live up to their end of the affordable housing agreement. I'd ask for waiver of notice.
Request for waiver. Here no. The notice is tabled. The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kentville native and teacher Burton Russell has spent the last 55 years researching sport in Nova Scotia, and whereas Mr. Russell has published 8 provincial bestsellers on sport in Nova Scotia and is considered by many a pioneer in sports research in this province, and whereas Mr. Russell's most recent book, Baseball Memories, explores the Nova Scotia Senior Baseball League's history from 1977 to 2002, therefore be resolved that the members of this House express our appreciation to Bertrand Russell for his significant contributions to preserving the history of sport in this province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be asking for waiver and passage without debate. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Sunday, February 15th, the service of dedication was held at the new St. Nicholas Anglican Church in Westwood Hills. Whereas this new church will serve the needs of this growing community. Whereas the celebration was led by Right Reverend Fred Hiltz and Reverend Arthur Nash. Therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the congregation of St. Nicholas Anglican Church on its accomplishments with best wishes on a great future. I ask for waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas secretarial services are vital to the success of any public or private service organization, institution, or business, and whereas April 18th to April 24th, 2004 is recognized as National Secretary Week, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize, congratulate all secretaries in Nova Scotia for their invaluable service. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the early evening hours of February 28 startled Barrington 70 Fire Chief John Nickerson when he looked out to see his neighbor's home on fire, and whereas Chief Nickerson attempted to extinguish the fire himself while dialing 911 to get the fire department on the road, and whereas despite Chief Nickerson's valiant attempts and those firefighters from Barrington 70, Barrington Passage, and Port Clyde.
Please. The clerks are having a hard time to hear the speaker on the floor. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Whereas despite Chief Nickerson's valiant attempts and those of firefighters from Barrington 70, Barrington Passage, and Port Clyde, the home of Blair and Bridget Atkinson was destroyed by fire. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs applaud the efforts of Barrington 70 Fire Chief John Nickerson and all firefighters who responded to the Atkinson's blaze for their bravery and dedication to the community in a time of need, while also congratulating the Barrington Food Mart for assisting the Atkinson family following the loss. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas over this last weekend, Coastal Communities Network held their annual general meeting, and whereas Coastal Communities Network provides a forum to encourage dialogue and share information that promotes the survival and enhancement of our rural coastal communities, and whereas since being established in 1992, the Coastal Communities Network has been actively involved in assisting rural communities throughout the province to deal more effectively with the social and economic problems, and is a large voice for small communities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the important work being done by the Coastal Communities Network. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Guysborough County members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 625, have donated more than $1,200 to Guysborough Options for Adaptive Living Society. And whereas Goals is a community-based organization that assists older adults in the Guysborough area with disabilities and helps them gain skills that they can use to enter the workforce and to contribute to society. And whereas the union members who hail from communities such as Canso, Whitehead, Charles Cove, Guysborough, and New Harbour raise the money through the sale of scrap metal and donations from its membership. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House join me in recognizing the efforts of the Guysborough County members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 625, in their fundraising efforts for Goals, and thank them for their support for this worthwhile organization. I request waiver of notice. Thank you.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 18 to 24 is Education Week in Nova Scotia, with the theme being Science, Question, Investigate, and Discover. And whereas science teachers from across Nova Scotia will be honoured for their outstanding work in education in a ceremony at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography today. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House recognize school boards, administrators, teachers, and education assistants for their dedication and pursuit of excellence in public education. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Pastor Leonard J. Anderson, 19th pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church of Upper Hammonds Plains, was recently one of 5 pastors from across Canada to be featured in Maclean's magazine article entitled Heroes of the Cross, whose author praised the 28-year-old pastor for breathing new life into the 159-year-old church. And whereas the small Emmanuel Baptist Church, which was founded by freed black slaves in 1845, will break ground this fall on its long-awaited $1.2 million expansion, which will triple the size of the church, a necessity now that the church is almost filled to capacity. And whereas Pastor Anderson has been recruited to represent Canada at a conference on Afro-Christian worship and social transformation that will be held at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina this summer. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send our congratulations to Pastor Anderson and the congregation of Emmanuel Baptist Church for being recognized by Maclean's magazine for all their efforts to bring enthusiasm and diversity to their local church. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1974, the Daman Association was created by a group of 15 and 16-year-olds who visited Daman, Lebanon, and returned to Halifax with a renewed conviction to celebrate their Lebanese heritage and share it with others. And whereas for 30 years this organization has continued to ensure their culture remains strong through support of the Lebanese school and annual involvement in the Multicultural Festival, this hard work culminated in the opening of the Daman Lebanese Center in 1995. And whereas the Honorary Consul of Lebanon in Halifax, Mr. Wadia M. Ferris, has awarded the Emigrant of the Year 2004 to the Daman Association of Canada for ensuring the Lebanese culture has continued to thrive in Halifax. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this legislature congratulate the Daman Association of Canada for this honour and acknowledge the contribution they have made to the cultural diversity of our province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas families who have lost their homes and most of their possessions in the Yarmouth apartment building fire last December are benefiting from the generosity of a local store and 2 local authors. And whereas Judge John Camo and lawyer Marcy Lynn Melvin teamed up to write the children's book, Ben Christmas Gates, to support Canadian Tire's Foundation for Families. And whereas the Canadian Tire store in Yarmouth donated all the proceeds from the book to help those affected by the fire, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the authors John Camo and Marcy Lynn Melvin and the Yarmouth Canadian Tire store owner Bert Goodwin for their generosity in the efforts to help the families who lost so much when their apartment building burnt last December. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mr. Roy Wynott of Bridgewater began his volunteer work at Hillside Pines Nursing Home in 1992 when his wife became a resident and continued to volunteer his time after his wife's passing in 1996. And whereas Mr. Wynott would stop by the store frequently to pick up needed items for residents as well as delivering specimens to the South Shore Regional Hospital every morning from Monday to Friday. Whereas Mr. Wynott, who became fondly known as the Candy Man for always remembering to pick up treats for residents and staff, was recently honored for his volunteer efforts in a special surprise reception at the Hillside Manor. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Mr. Wynott for his kindness, his dedication to others in his community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas emergency workers, both volunteer and paid, quickly came together this morning following a train derailment in the Sutherlands River area. And whereas the 64-car freight train lost 9 cars which rolled down an embankment. And whereas some of the derailed cars were carrying full loads of propane and butane, which resulted in the evacuation of 2 local schools and 2 homes. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs compliment the work of all emergency responders and be grateful for the fact that there were no injuries in what could have been a potentially disastrous situation in eastern Pictou County. And I ask for waiver notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Citadel.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Halifax Citadel native Stephanie Hughes, a recent graduate of Brown University, has contributed greatly to a sport of swimming in Nova Scotia. And whereas as a past member of the Trojan Aquatic Club and Nova Scotia Canada Games member, she has proved herself to be a role model for young athletes in our province And whereas Stephanie Hughes is now training in California with Stanford University to represent both her province of Nova Scotia and the country of Canada in the 2004 Summer Olympics in Athens, Greece. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House congratulate Ms. Hughes for her dedication to her sport and wish great success to her for her Olympic trials this summer. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of passage without debate.
Request for waivers that agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion's carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on March 20, 2004, the Black Cultural Centre for Nova Scotia honoured Halifax Regional Police officers of African heritage. And whereas the Halifax Regional Police Wall of Recognition was created to acknowledge their contribution to our community. And whereas Constable Robin Atwell was recognized for being the first female Halifax Regional Police officer of African heritage in Nova Scotia's history. Therefore, it be resolved that members of this House congratulate Constable Robin Atwell and honour her for her outstanding service to our communities. And I'd ask for waiver.
Request for waivers that agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers play a very important role in our communities, and whereas Paul Dimone, a veteran of Canada's Armed Forces, is one of those volunteers who has given so generously of his time over the years to serve the members of his community. And whereas Paul Dimone has been recognized for his contribution to society and been chosen as the Volunteer of the Year for the town of Lunenburg. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Paul Dimone for being chosen as the Volunteer of the Year for the town of Lunenburg and thank him for all the time he has given, for all that he has given to the people of Lunenburg and Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers that agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I here give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Duke of Edinburgh's awards were established on a voluntary and non-competitive basis in the mid-1950s, divided into three categories, bronze, silver, and gold, to challenge young people between the ages of 14 to 25. Whereas to receive the Duke of Edinburgh's award, each participant must complete 4 components: physical activity, skill development, service to the community, finally outdoor expedition, to receive the gold award. Whereas Ashley Daigneault of Kingston has achieved the 5 components necessary to receive the gold award by participating in minor basketball as a coach, yearbook committee, peer tutoring, 70 hours, as well as basketball, track and field, and mountain climbing in New Hampshire. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House congratulate Ms. Daigneault for this tremendous accomplishment and wish her every success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers that agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the leader of the Nova Scotia NDP is proving once again that he will change his position on any issue in order to enhance his electability rather than provide a rational alternative to government. Whereas this is best demonstrated by the NDP leader's flip-flop on an insurance all-party committee and his advocacy of a public no-fault insurance plan. And whereas after opposing the call of the Liberal caucus for an all-party committee in 2002, the leader of the NDP now thinks an all-party committee on insurance is a good idea.
What a good idea.
Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize that the NDP leader once opposed an all-party committee on insurance in 2002, but he has now made a complete flip-flop, proving once again to Nova Scotians that the leader of the NDP will say anything and do anything to get elected, regardless of whether he believes it or not.
Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that in a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers are special people who give freely of their time to help others in our communities. And whereas Barbara Miller has generously given of her time for many years to serve the members of her community. And whereas Barbara Miller has been recognized for her contribution to society and been chosen as Volunteer of the Year for the town of Mahone Bay. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Barbara Miller for being chosen as the Volunteer of the Year for the town of Mahone Bay and thank her for all that she's given to the people of Mahone Bay and Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers that agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, please call the order of business public bills for second reading.
Second reading.
Speaker, would you please call bill number 40, the Assessment Act, as during debate.
Bill number 40, the Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have left?
Approximately 30 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to rise on this and speak on this bill again today. And I'm going to be brief today because there's some problems with the bill that we've discussed the other day when I was speaking, and some things I believe that have to be changed. And I realize and hope that the government's mind is in the right place and their hearts are in the right place with this bill, and it's a very difficult thing to put in place and be fair to everybody, and it's a problem that's been around, I think, ever since property tax was ever...
Order, please. Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber. I'd ask the members to take their conversations outside, please. The Honourable Member for Preston has the floor.
Thank you. As I was saying, it's a very difficult balance to put in place between what is fair and what is needed and what really needs to be done. So I commend the government for trying to correct this inequity for a lot of people in the area. However, I do believe that there's many problems with this bill. It's as I said the other day, it's very difficult to understand. And when I went through this with the Legislative Council, found out that the meaning of the bill sure isn't the same as what the wording in the bill is, although I guess it does the same thing. So I'm going to wrap up here quite quickly, and just with the following points. Number one, we have to protect the people that need help. In other words, the seniors out there that are losing their homes or have to sell their homes because their property taxes have gone too high. We need to protect the people such as someone that's on a disability pension through no fault of their own and their income has been basically frozen and their assessments go up, they have to sell their home. Or the person that's on Canada pension, the same thing. Anyone that's on a fixed income that doesn't have the opportunity to really make more money to help pay any increases they may have in their property. So that's the main thing that I can see that this bill has to address. The second thing that it has to address is stability and funding for the municipalities. The municipalities have to have stable funding so they can provide the important services that they provide to the residents of their community. So when those taxes are paid, they're sufficient to pay for the services that are needed by the community. Things such as people may want as street lights, curbs, sewer water, road maintenance, whatever the case may be, police and fire service, all those important services that people demand today. So I think that's the second most important element in this bill. And the third thing that the bill must do, and with this I'm going to wrap up, the bill must be clear, and the conditions and terms of the bill must be very clearly written in the bill. In other words, if we're going to talk about a freeze on assessment and a formula for doing that, that should be spelled out in the bill. It shouldn't be left to regulation afterwards that can be changed and moved around at will, and people never know exactly where they're going to be or how they're going to be addressed. So I think those are the three key elements as far as I can see them in the bill, and hopefully we'll be bringing some amendments forward on the bill as it goes through the process, and hopefully we'll get concurrence with the other parties and make this a bill that's good for the people it's really meant to protect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Pictou West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome this opportunity to have a few minutes to speak on Bill 40, the Assessment Act, and its implications on all Nova Scotians. I guess as an MLA, I've had quite a number of people coming to me and my office with concerns or issues around assessment, and I'm sure we all have from time to time, and it's usually related to the fact that their assessment is going up, or it's too high, or perhaps how to appeal it, or how, if they've missed the deadline, what remedies they might have. And I know I've dealt with a few different individuals in my riding that have come to me. One family in particular I can think of that their assessment jumped from $58,000 to $88,000, and you know, that's a big major jump all at once, and and a real concern to them. And so they've appealed. But I guess the biggest issue is around the appeal process and how long it takes. And some of them even though the January date is 3 weeks after that for appealing, some of them still not have heard back when their appeal date is going to be. And I've had an opportunity to discuss that with the Northern Regional Director of Assessment, and we're working to try to get that straightened out. But certainly assessment appeals and the process is slow, and people have concerns about their appeals going up. Now, I know that's not directly related to the bill, but it's still an assessment concern that I'm hearing about. In fact, I was talking to one lady this morning that contacted me on that very issue. She appealed in January. As of yet, she has not heard whether she's getting a hearing date when her assessment appeal will be heard. So she's hopeful that will come very soon. I was going to speak for a minute or two, Mr. Speaker, on I guess my perspective in my previous life, I guess, as a realtor and involved in real estate sales, and certainly assessment is an important part or a big part of determining the market value of a property. And people look at the assessment and then figure out, should it be a bit higher? Is it 10% higher than the assessed value? Is that the price I should ask for my property, or is it 20% higher? It's usually a little bit higher than what the actual assessment is. But over the past 2.5 years or so, I had the opportunity to work in real estate sales, and met a lot of interesting people, a lot of local people that wanted to put their property up for sale, others that were interested in buying, and certainly ran across a lot of people that from other areas of the country and other areas of North America, and even from Europe and elsewhere from time to time, that are interested in buying properties here in Nova Scotia. And coming from the North Shore of this province, maybe there's property is in many ways considered a real buy. It's a lesser price maybe than on the South Shore or around the Brador Lakes, but nonetheless, property is still going up and away. And I just want to give one example of I had a potential buyer I was dealing with from the state of Arizona, and they were looking for farm property, and I showed them half a dozen different properties, and finally they made an offer on one of them. However, they had to get back to the U.S., and so we were doing this by telephone and by fax, and the time came to decide what kind of a price they were going to put on, or what kind of an offer they're going to make. And I think the property was listed around $79,900 at the time, and she said, "Well, we'll offer the price. We'll $79,900. That's only $50-some thousand in our money, so it was good value in their opinion, and there was no problem paying that kind of money. But when you come from a market where properties are 4, 5, 10 times as high in some cases, our real estate is really cheap here in Nova Scotia, and it's considered good value. So there was no difficulty in their case in buying that farm property at the listed price. I just want to give another example of how maybe the assessed value maybe doesn't have any indication on what the market value is going to be, and this is where we really run into problems. I had listed a property, was I think around 4.5 acres on the water near River John, and a beautiful beach and a nice piece of property, and it had a house on it that was half finished, and the owners living in Ontario felt that they probably weren't going to be able to get back here, and so they decided to sell. And but they had in their minds, maybe based on the property values they saw in north of Toronto, that it probably is worth a whole lot of money. So I think we listed it at somewhere at $220,000 or $225,000 in that range, which seemed like a lot of money for that acreage and a half-finished home. But lo and behold, we did list it in that price range, and there was somebody that was interested in the property, mainly because of the beautiful sandy beach, and from the state of New York, and they came in and they bought it. And wow, it surprised me. It surprised everybody probably in that, so the market value was probably considerably higher than what we thought it was, only because there was a buyer out there willing to pay a seller the kind of money he was asking. Now, this particular bill, Bill 40, is going to change a little bit the probably what we call market value, because market value is an indication what a willing buyer is willing to pay a willing seller, neither of them being under any undue pressure. And, if somebody from away is adding, wants to buy a property for, considerably more than what we might think is the market value, it sometimes happens, but it's going to affect in the future by putting a cap on assessments. The assessment will be kept down, and it may prevent the real market value from going up there. Mr. Speaker, I want to, read what a definition of market value is, and this is taken directly from the Nova Scotia Real Estate licensing book, and it's a definition that's given here. Market value is the highest price estimated in terms of money which the property would bring if exposed for sale on the open market by a willing seller, allowing a reasonable time to find a willing buyer, neither the buyer nor the seller acting under compulsion, both having full knowledge of the uses and purposes to which the property is adapted and for which it is capable of being used, and both exercise an intelligent judgment. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll file that, if somebody wants to pick it up. But basically, in a nutshell, then, market value is what a willing buyer will pay a willing seller, neither being under any undue pressure. But when this act is, should it pass, in some ways it's going to influence market value because it'll keep down the assessed value, and that in turn might determine in people's minds that it's not worth as much as it perhaps could be. I guess I want to move on a little bit. As I mentioned, sometimes a price on a property can sell really, really high, and that is determined by one buyer that might come along at the right time and pay a higher price than ordinarily residents in the area might consider a good buy or might consider market value. And when that happens, and in this case this property was bought by the individual from New York State, it certainly brought up the value of that property, but it probably also brought up the value of neighboring properties and adjacent properties around it. And and I suppose if they're in the market to sell their property, that's probably good because it's bringing up the market value. But many of those people probably are not wanting to sell; they're not even thinking about it, and so their assessment may also be detrimentally affected by going up, just because one or two sales in their area has increased the value of those properties, and that in turn might put the assessment up on their own cottage or home or property. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the shore. It could be inland. It could be in town or in the city. I think when you see one or two properties going up, it puts demand to increase the assessment on similar or neighboring properties. And I think, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, sometimes that can really put some difficulties for those neighbors in that their assessment is going up. It may go up 50%, it may go up 100%, maybe it'll double, and it makes some difficulty for those on fixed incomes. People that maybe are trying to survive on a very low income of $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000, all of a sudden they're seeing their assessment going up, and maybe coupled with other homeowner costs like rise in property insurance or other maintenance costs on their home, it's really putting them into a position where perhaps they can no longer afford to keep their home or keep their cottage or their resource property, whatever the case may be. But other pressures continuing on on their ownership of property that doesn't allow them to maybe to continue to own that particular property. And I think that's what this bill is partly trying to address, is certainly the problems when neighbors' property goes up in value suddenly. That puts increased pressure on their property, their assessment goes up, and it's getting to the point where some people are almost forced to sell, even though they may not wish to, because they can't afford the increased taxes that are as a result of increased assessment. I guess I want to move on. In the bill there it mentions the term ordinarily resident, and the exemption here, if a cap were to come into place, would apply to those that are ordinarily resident of a property in a community, and if the assessment has gone up considerably, they may be eligible for the cap. But how do you determine what ordinarily resident means? Is it somebody that has to live there 12 months of the year? Or is it somebody that maybe is there for the majority of the year, in other words, over 6 months? Is it 3 months? I'm not sure, or it's not clear to me what it means by ordinarily resident. If they live in Halifax and own a cottage in Cape John on a seasonal basis, if they're up there every weekend, are they an ordinarily resident because it's a cottage, even though they live in another spot in the province? Or if they lived in Moncton, New Brunswick, and they come down to a cottage on the Amherst shore, would they be eligible for this cap on assessed properties? I think that needs a little more clarification on what's meant by that term, ordinarily resident. I guess my concerns, if there's any, primarily is around the cap that's being suggested on assessment. How do you determine what that cap should be? It certainly doesn't mention in the bill that cap is going to be 1% or 5% or 10%. I've heard as high as 25%. I've heard it may be tied to the consumer price index. Who is going to determine that cap? Is it going to be the minister of the day, or is it going to be the municipality? Will it be uniform across the whole province, or will it be set by each municipality, of which there's 55 in the whole province? Is that something you're going to be negotiating with UNSM? I'm just wondering what the process is. How will you sit down and determine what the cap should be? And I guess if there is a cap that comes about, and that will reduce the amount of assessment, which in turn will reduce the amount of taxes that a municipality will collect, how are those taxes going to be made up for the municipality to look after the services that they are required to do? Is the province going to make up that difference for them? Or does the municipality have to make it up through an increase in the mill rate, or the amount of tax rate on the residential assessment? Or will it be on the business assessment? Will it be on the business occupancy tax? There's a lot of unanswered questions here, but how does the municipality make up for what is clearly going to be less assessment and therefore less tax revenue? I guess I would suggest, Mr. Minister, that certainly you consult and work and in conjunction with the UNSM and make sure that an agreement is coming that will, work for the municipalities as well as the province. If there's less money, I'm just thinking, I know my own municipality, the assessed rate is a little less than $1 per $100 of assessment, or in other words, let's say it is $1 or $10 on 1,000. On $1 million of assessment, they could lose $10,000. And if there's, I don't know, every municipality will be different. But let's just say an example of a municipality like had a $1 tax rate on $100 of assessment, and they were to lose $5 million worth of assessed property because of a cap. that means they would lose $50,000, I guess, in property taxes. How's that $50,000 going to be made up? The money they need for fire and police services and water and sewer projects and all the other municipal services that are provided. I guess in closing, Mr. Speaker, my concerns with this bill, and I think there's some problems with it. As I mentioned, there's the cap, how much it will be, how will the loss of revenue be made up to the municipality, and the other concern certainly is around neighbors in an area where assessments are rising dramatically. How will they be affected, and just how will loss of revenue be made up to the municipality? So I guess with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I've had my 2 cents worth on this bill, and I'll pass it along to somebody else. I look forward to hearing at law amendments what the public has to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
I have no
The
light.
honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. It's a pleasure to rise today to talk about Bill 40 and give a little bit of a reaction to it, an act to amend the Assessment Act. We've heard a great deal in the opening statements about how this act affects coastal communities and rural communities, and I think it's really important to look at what the act will do in an urban setting. The riding that I represent, Clayton Park, has a large proportion of rental units and a lot of condominiums, and I'm concerned that it doesn't adequately address the needs of those residents of our province. It seems to me, on looking at the act in total, that it's far too broad. It's just taken a very broad approach that says we'll protect everybody's assessment, everybody who currently owns a house, that is. If you own a home or a cottage or another property that's just for recreation, those properties are going to be capped or protected, let's say, in some way over time. But I think that we haven't perhaps properly thought out the implications of that, and that before this goes into its final form, that there should be amendments made that will certainly address that. Number one, if we decide to remain with the idea that it covers all property owners, then I think we have to include the condominium owners in that, because they would be adversely affected and they would be part of the group that would be cross-subsidizing homeowners in this province. What will happen, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, as soon as you put an artificial cap on assessments for any property owners or class of property owners, you're going to shift the burden to someone else. And the shift in this case, and certainly in the area I represent, will go largely to commercial, because we have a lot of commercial properties. But in HRM at present, the commercial rate is 2.5 times the residential rate, which means that they're already cross-subsidizing homeowners, and if there is no capacity for the city to increase with the market value growing on residential, then they will put more of that onto the commercial or to the rental properties. And there's no way to shelter rental property renters from that, because that will be passed on to them. If their taxes have gone up greatly for an area, it will be passed on to the renters. So I think there has to be a capacity to protect people who choose to rent rather than own a property, if indeed we are looking at capping all of the ownership properties. And again, that the condominium owners have to be included in that, because they have chosen to sell their homes perhaps and buy a different kind of property. And that doesn't seem to be covered in here at the moment. Again, I feel that it's far too broad, and in fact, it's a bit like using a sledgehammer when we know there are some very finely identified areas of concern, mainly in a few communities. I think the UNSM named 3 communities that were most concerned about rising coastal properties going up in value, and in fact, it isn't something that needs to be addressed the same way across the province. So this is a one-size-fits-all. It's going to work across the province over time. And when I speak about time passing, what we're going to have is an extreme inequity as time passes, because certain properties will continue to be under this shelter as they stay in one family and continue to be passed along in one family, whereas others will rise and as those properties are sold. And so over time, we're going to have some tremendous inequities that arise, and it's inevitable that we'll have to face the question of fairness. And it won't pass the test of fairness when newcomers to our province, who we desperately want, we want to attract newcomers, when they're being charged a considerably higher rate of taxation municipally than their neighbors who have been here for longer. That isn't a very welcoming situation for people who are moving into our province. And to go along with that, what happens to our children? Because unless they take our own family home, they'll be buying their own homes. And as soon as they buy into another home, and as they grow up, they're going to be paying much higher than their neighbors who happen to have lived there for a period of time that's covered under this shelter. So I think we're not considering the impact on young people as well. And again, you know, where I represent a city and a part of the city that's growing, as many others do here from HRM, we have to consider the impact as the city grows and we attract young people and hopefully newcomers from other provinces and other places. And so really over time, we've taken an approach that this act would protect everybody equally who's here now and has the luxury of owning a property as of 2001, I think, when this will be backdated too. So really, I think that we have to be far more sensitive to the nuances of the bill, and that there is room for a lot of change that might more adequately address the problem. From my experience as a number of years as a city councillor, the real complaints and problems come from people on low income who are striving to stay in their own homes. And if they've owned them for a large number of years and they happen to be retired now on fixed incomes, or perhaps they're disabled, they have unique concerns and needs. And that's not the same as the needs that we have with other people who are still in the workforce, who actually, as our properties go up in value, we have to say it, have a much increased capacity to pay. We certainly have a much greater net worth. And those properties are valuable. The market rate is what's being set. It's of no interest to somebody who's on a fixed income, however, because they may be forced from their home. And that is generally the seniors, and I'm sure that others here have heard the same thing, that the older people who have a limited capacity to generate a cash flow, they just have a fixed income, it's difficult for them to continue to keep pace with the rising assessments. And I think when we know that that's where the problem lies, we shouldn't have a blanket approach that's going to protect and cover everybody, because the bottom line is, again, looking at the natural implication of this, is that we're going to leave the municipalities with a problem where they're going to have to still raise a certain amount of income to adequately provide services, as has been said. So they're going to have less flexibility in doing that, and they'll either have to increase their rates, which means everybody's going to pay more anyway. Even though your taxable assessment has been left lower, you'll still be paying a higher rate of taxation because the cities and the municipalities need that money in order to provide even basic services. Or, as I said, the impact or the weight of it will be shifted to commercial properties, to perhaps business occupancy if that's still around, and certainly to people who own large rental complexes and apartments. So again, certain people will be protected, others will not, and those costs come back to us in terms of lost productivity or a lack of friendliness to the business community, which is not something that we strive to do. So I think that it's gone too far in a number of ways. As I say, another area I'd like to look at is the fact that it goes beyond owner-occupied homes. And it is good. I mean, I know that people want to have some control over the annual increases that they're struck with. And I think that for owner-occupied homes, the idea of a prescribed cap might be worthwhile to look at, so that in a single year you didn't have such a huge increase, that if your property went up 30 or 40% in a single year, that might be spread out over several years, so that the impact is a little bit more softened, so that you're not taking such a huge hit in a single year. And I know there are other municipalities that have done that in other provinces, where they will say perhaps the maximum increase in a given year might be 10%, and you would then phase that in over a number of years if your market assessment had risen quickly. And so that's one thing that could be done. But again, speaking as somebody who has a recreational property, we have a cottage ourselves in Queens County, and I think that the people that need to be protected in the area where my cottage is are the people who live there year-round in this small coastal community. And my family, as a city family who go there for recreation, don't need the same kind of protection. But if people are building large homes and large summer homes in these communities, it's making it difficult for the year-round residents to stay there. And I think that they're the people we need to protect. That if they're living in an area where a lot of the coastal properties are going up quickly in assessment, people that are not living there year-round, I think that needs to be examined more carefully to see whether or not as a blanket across the board, whether or not those properties should be protected from rising assessments based on market value. But I think owner-occupied homes, definitely, we can look at that, because that is quite different, and it does support those coastal communities, and they're the ones that are threatened with being pushed out of areas where they've traditionally or lived for many generations. So I think that's just one of those nuances in the bill that needs to be looked at more carefully. As I said, over time, I think we're going to see huge inequities that will particularly hurt young people who are starting out in their lives, and that isn't a very good way to begin, to make a city or a municipality that's going to attract young people. I think that the important thing is that we hear from as many people as possible when the law amendments does sit on this act, so that we can get more information and a greater chance to look at the implications of what's proposed currently. And I think it is, I hope I did say it is a good start, because it opens the debate. And I think one of the things that has definitely become obvious to all of us is that there are people that are in need of some addressing of this problem, people that we need to help. And so it's important that we begin to talk about it, and it is a good first step in that regard. But I think it's really falling short in many ways and does need to be improved with some amendments. My understanding was that it's somewhat based on a proposition, it might be Proposition 13 from California, which addressed the same thing on coastal properties particularly. And I'd like to know more about how that's actually worked in that jurisdiction. So maybe, is it the right one? Anyway, we'll see. I'd certainly like to see how that has worked, and if there is a model where this particular type of bill has worked, if we've changed assessments to this type. Because I think that there is really nothing new under the sun, and Nova Scotia should learn from the best in the world and use what applies here from that way, rather than perhaps trying to piece something together that doesn't work here and hasn't worked well in other places. So those are principally what I wanted to say on the issue. I think that we need to look more at amendments that might fine-tune this so that it helps those who need it most, and that would be people on fixed incomes, seniors, and that group, and not try to capture everybody in Nova Scotia under one blanket approach. And I would hope to hear more about this at law amendments, where we can hopefully come up with some good amendments for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize an honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak to Bill 40. And I want the members of this legislative assembly to know that skyrocketing assessments is an issue that's been around for a number of years. It's been around for approximately 10 years. As a matter of fact, it started out as non-resident ownership, and because non-resident ownership was acquiring property throughout Nova Scotia, and mostly in rural communities where seniors and people were on fixed incomes, was in fact affecting those particular communities. Now, I know it became such an issue that our member from Timberley Prospect brought this issue before the Legislative Assembly when the Liberal government was in power. The Liberal government was in power, and they had an opportunity in 1998 to address this very issue, Mr. Speaker. And the member of Timberley Prospect brought it before the then Minister of it was called then Municipal Affairs. And Mr. Speaker, the government chose the order of the day, as typical, to do absolutely nothing. Then we brought it forward again in 1999 after the next provincial election, which saw the Liberal Party on the bench as a third party and the new government of the Tory government in power. It is now approximately 5 years since the Conservative government came to power that this bill is now before the House with respect to address the property assessments. And I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that in fact, it is because of the persistence of the member from Timberley Prospect, who continuously brought this issue before the legislature. The member from Timberley Prospect not only brought this issue to the legislature by way of resolution, he had questioned the Minister of Municipal Relations, and then the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and then the Minister of Municipal Relations and Service, Nova Scotia, on a number of occasions. The then minister is now the Minister of Health. So this government is very much aware of the seriousness of this very high this issue of skyrocketing assessments, particularly as it pertains to the Royal area. And Mr. Speaker, there was a striking moment in this legislature that really really caught my eye, because although I grew up in a small rural community and recognized that people were buying property from as non-residents, they were not from the province, and for the most part, people in small rural communities call them foreigners, and they came in and they bought up the property. I didn't realize until I came to this Legislative Assembly what kind of an effect that had, not only on the individuals whom in fact were living adjacent to the property, but the effect that it had on an entire community. And in most parts, because communities are affected by the assessment, because as you know, and I know, that assessments are based on a property that is sold in a given year in a particular community, and if the community is relatively small, can have a significant impact. So to get back to the issue that was really striking to me was in fact when the member from Kimberley Prospect brought an issue with respect to a Mr. Creaser, I believe, of Hurdle Beach. And Mr. Creaser saw his assessment move from $80,000 a year to $380,000. A guy who did absolutely nothing to his home, a guy who was on a fixed income, who lived in a community who knew full well that he could never pay the taxes if in fact the tax would have been assessed to that property, and I don't know if it had been, and it might very well have been, based on the assessed value to the property. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of municipal politicians, former municipal politicians in this Legislative Assembly, and there are a number of former municipal politicians on the government side. And I find it rather distasteful that we have to wait, not with respect to the, wait till I complete my sentence. Distasteful by the fact that we have to be in this House debating an assessment piece of legislation that could have really received the cooperation of both levels of government if they really wanted to get down and do it, rather than moving the assessment to the point whereby it not only taxes people to the point whereby they can no longer own their home, but move them out of their communities altogether. Now the issue is not only coastal properties, it's become an even greater issue with respect to communities all along, even right now in the Halifax Regional Municipality. The community of Waverly Fall River, $1 million homes being built in the community of Waverly Fall River, where people lived in modest homes and earned modest incomes for a number of years, and now are faced with having to move out of those communities where they lived all their lives because other people are moving in. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the non-resident property ownership, I do know that the voluntary planning report, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I'll title it appropriately. It was in fact the Voluntary Planning Task Force. And as a matter of fact, it had a number of meetings across the province, dealing primarily with the issue of non-resident ownership on property. And it had some 455 presenters, people who attended community meetings across this province. They had another 128 written responses with respect to this non-resident ownership, an issue that has obviously been solved merely in Prince Edward Island to the satisfaction of the existing residential community, the existing residents of PEI, as well as to those people who invest and buy the property who no longer live there. However, I attended a meeting in the Eastern Shore in a community called Sheet Harbor at a public meeting in a fire station, and I know an honorable member across the floor was there. And the honorable member knows the number of people who were there was somewhat small, but those individuals were quite concerned with respect to how property was being meted out and being sold either by realtor, real estate people, investors or whatever, where was being sold in the province of Nova Scotia. And I heard that evening that this has become such a very important issue that in certain parts of Nova Scotia, Nova Scotians can no longer enjoy or buy property in particularly beautiful scenic areas in which they'd like to buy. For example, Bedeck. Do you know that Bedeck is owned the properties, I shouldn't say Bedeque, the town of Bedeque, because that would be wrong, but most of the properties on the Bedeque lakes and the Bredor lakes are owned by individuals outside the province, for the most part, and that's a fact. And that's unfortunate because it affected the individuals who lived right in the town of Bedeque proper, and it also affected individuals who lived out in the rural areas of Bedeque. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Member Cape Breton West.
Speaker, a brief question to the honourable member. I presume.
Member Cape Dartmouth North, would you accept the question?
Sure, Mr. Speaker. I would just remind the honourable member not to make it too difficult.
Member Cape Breton West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try not to confuse him with the facts. The question being, could he table the information that would suggest that the majority of the landowners' tenureship in the Bedeque area is from outside the province?
Member Dartmouth North.
No, Mr. Speaker, it's not possible for me to table the information, and I acknowledge the honourable member's comment with respect to that. If the honourable member will remember, I did say that I heard this at a meeting. Did I not say that? And I'm sure that Hansard will in fact bring that forward, that I did say that I stated that I was reading from no text or no report with respect to the information. And obviously, one can say that this is hearsay information. It's purely speculative. But if the honourable member, and I know that the honourable member will rise to his feet, because that honourable member will surely enlighten me with respect to any errors that I have made with respect to my speak here today. And I can assure them, because that honourable member is the kind of honourable member who will make sure that if there's a way to bring about correctness in this legislative assembly, he will attempt to do so. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you that the issue is an extremely serious one. The Voluntary Planning Task Report that made this presentation, that presented this to the government, presented a number of recommendations. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I don't believe that any of those recommendations were enacted upon. Again, I stand to be corrected, but I don't believe that any of those recommendations were enacted upon. But I also remember, Mr. Speaker, when I first came here in 1998, that the Voluntary Planning Task Report, the Voluntary Task Committee, provided another report. And that report was on the incomes of Nova Scotians. And it said, for the most part, that Nova Scotians earn an income, 50% of them earn an income of less than $25,000 a year. And that's within the report, so I don't have to table it. The report is available to everyone. Also, another 23% of Nova Scotians earn an income of less than $16,000 a year. Many of those individuals, Mr. Speaker, are individuals who are seniors, who live in rural communities, whose incomes are fixed. They're either through a Canada pension and an old age income and an income supplement, or a combination thereof of each of those. Many of those incomes do not exceed the $16,000 to $18,000 bracket. Many of those seniors have worked very hard for their homesteads to keep their homesteads. As a matter of fact, we're extremely excited when their properties were paid off. They own this piece of property after working very hard and making sure that that piece of property was going to be theirs forever and a day, made personal sacrifices. Some of them made personal sacrifices with respect to rather they would want to have heat in a particular time because the heat bill may have consumed but it consumed a good portion of their income. So many of those seniors, in fact, turned around and made a deliberate attempt to make sure that they had the money to continue to pay their property tax. And I know that there are people whom, in fact, Mr. Speaker, whom, in fact, know that. There are individuals whom, in fact, from rural communities who know the lifestyles of individuals, how they must, in turn, met their dollars out, the meager dollars that they have, in order to keep their properties. No one, that's not magical. For anyone who served on municipal government, We know it, Mr. Speaker. We also know that in the last 3 years, at least 4 years, since this has become an issue, skyrocketing property assessments, that in fact the government of the day has had conversation with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities. The Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities and this government should have addressed that particular issue by now, Mr. Speaker, instead of leaving it to the sacrifice and causing the hardship to those Nova Scotians who are living on fixed incomes and who are living in modest homes. Can you imagine, just imagine, what the tax rate must have been to that property owner of Mr. Creaser of Hurdle Beach, when in fact, you know, he had a modest home of $80,000, and he goes to and goes to see his property at a future year, which was the next year, jump from $80,000 to $380,000, and the municipality, lo and behold, turns around and says, well, you know, that's a responsibility of the provincial government. The provincial government does the assessments. And thank God for that, Mr. Speaker, because I can tell you if assessments were left to individual municipalities prior to 1972 in this province, you would have seen a total mess. And as a matter of fact, where assessments were left to individual municipalities in Ontario, you did see a mess in certain parts of it until they had finally resolved and straightened out the matter. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the province does make the assessment. But the assessment is a real market value of that property in that given year. The municipality doesn't have to set a tax rate that will dramatically affect the individual's property if they don't want to. They can turn around, as all of us who have been involved in municipal government know. We sit at the municipal government table or the council chamber, and we say, how much is it going to cost the municipality to operate in a given year? And when we find out how much it's going to cost the municipality to operate in a given year, and how many tax dollars that requires, then we set the tax rate or the mill rate based upon the amount of assessment we have and the amount of dollars that we need in order to operate the municipality. Now, there's no magic to that. A municipal government turns around, and I've seen comments from municipal councillors in the paper with respect to the government downloading or creating a responsibility for them. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, if in fact the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities would have met with this government and genuinely sat down to discuss the issue, that the issue would be resolved. Now, the province does help individuals whom in fact have difficulty with respect to their property taxes. As a matter of fact, the Liberal government cut the property tax rebate out to seniors completely when they were in power, Mr. Speaker. The Tory government, to their credit, when they came into power, Mr. Speaker, gradually phased in the property tax rebate to those individuals who were on a fixed income. And now it's up to the maximum of $400. It started out as $100, $200, and then it jumped to $400. And I believe today that if we look at the pamphlets that are provided, that it's a maximum of $400 to people on an income of less than $26,000 a year or whatever. It's based on their income, and they do make application to it. Mr. Speaker, the same thing applies to the municipalities. The municipalities have two ways of addressing the issue with respect to the effect of increased property taxes on individuals with fixed income. One is they provide a property tax exemption. And that property tax exemption is complementary to the provincial governments, and it is prorated on a basis of based on the income and how much money, to a maximum, I believe, of $400 as well, although I stand to be corrected on that. The other issue, Mr. Speaker, on the way the municipal governments address the issue is by way of property tax deferral. Property tax deferral, Mr. Speaker, allows the property owner to defer the property taxes accrued to the property until such time as the property is sold or the individual is capable of paying the property. I can tell you that very few people in my day, during my term in municipal government, ever wanted to go down that road, because the municipality gets a lien on the property. And before the property can be sold or anything, Mr. Speaker, the individual property tax comes off of that property for the X number of years that it may have been behind. Now, I don't know if that in fact is if that in fact there is interest on that or not, and I should know, Mr. Speaker, and I do say that I should have brushed up on that before, but I believe there is a small portion of interest accumulated on that to offset any costs that might occur. But I can tell you, I've seen seniors and heard of seniors who have gone without rather than put their property into a property tax deferral, simply because they have worked too hard. They don't believe that anyone should be having a lien on their property, particularly after they have paid their mortgage off and their property is free for them to have and enjoy. And they don't want that onus of responsibility passed on to their offspring, their children, their sons, their daughters, their grandchildren, Mr. Speaker. They don't want that passed on. So contrary to any municipality that tells you that property tax deferral is a way to go, excuse me, I can tell you, during the period of time that I served on municipal council, as a matter of fact, there was one time when no one took advantage of a property tax deferral. And we had asked, why would no one take advantage of a property tax deferral? That, Mr. Speaker, is how I've learned of why there is no one interested in accepting a property tax deferral. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that truly lies on the doorstep of both levels of government. It's an issue that should have been addressed by both levels of government. And Mr. Speaker, the unfortunate part of it, it hasn't. But I must say that I have to say to my colleague and his persistence, my colleague from Timberley Prospect, excuse me, who's in this legislature, because of his persistence, and because of us being here as the official opposition, we assisted in carrying that banner of skyrocketing assessments, and the fact that those skyrocketing assessments went into increased property taxes to people who could least afford it. And that issue came here in the legislature time and time again. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that I am pleased to see that this government has at least said that because there is no unanimity with the UNSM, or there can be no agreement, or they have been unable to this date to get an agreement with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipality on this property tax assessment, that they're going to go it alone. Sometimes it takes that kind of a stick. Excuse me.
All member for Dartmouth North has the floor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's quiet. I thought that, this speak was going on so well that people were listening intently, and that they were grasping at every minute of it, and that they were absorbing it, and they were certainly going to challenge me after the speak was over with respect to some of the comments I had made. But however, I must say that it's a pleasure to see that there is some there is some conversation with respect. And Mr. Speaker, I can only believe that the conversation that's going on in the back is because they want to make sure that the statistical information that I have provided them is correct, and that they want to make sure that the information that I'm passing on to this legislative assembly is one that they can agree with. But I must say that sometimes, Mr. Speaker, you have to bring the stick. It's unfortunate that levels of government, and this is what really irks, I believe, the Nova Scotia voters, is that governments take so long to address an issue that is so dear to their hearts. And skyrocketing assessments and increased tax rates were an issue that is extremely dear to their heart. And yet nobody seemed to address it until this day, when the Bill 40 is before this House, or making an attempt to address it. My hope is, Mr. Speaker, is when the presenters, when this bill leaves this chamber here after second reading and goes to law amendments, and in fact the witnesses and the presenters come before this bill, that my hope is that those witnesses and presenters bring some valid information with respect to how they can best resolve this together, so that Nova Scotians are the benefactor of being able to continue to live in their homes, and not only be being pushed out of their homes, but being pushed out of their communities altogether. The unfortunate part of it is, as we know, this issue became an issue as a result of non-resident ownership, once again, and skyrocketing assessments. But it even shifted into further now, Mr. Speaker, as I have said earlier, it shifted into communities because of in-migration, from people out migrating from their communities into Halifax, the Halifax Regional Municipality, and putting added pressures on to the HRM. And those added pressures put added pressures upon the developers and people in the business community and people who invest in property to gentrify neighborhoods. And what I mean by gentrifying a neighborhood is that they tear down the dilapidated buildings, put in new buildings, bring in upscale development, and move the people who could afford to live in those neighborhoods out into some other area where they're lost and they don't know where they're going, and they just have to simply move from a neighborhood that they might have lived there for 45 or 50 years. A neighborhood that's been part of their community. And Mr. Speaker, I've witnessed it. And the constituency, rather you want to believe it or not, the constituency of Dartmouth North has seen a significant bit of development going in that direction, where people are moved out of the community and no longer can afford to live in those neighborhoods. This may not appear to be a serious issue with some members of the Legislative Assembly, but I can't imagine anyone who it wouldn't be a serious issue with, and I can't imagine anyone who certainly wouldn't want this issue addressed. Mr. Speaker, while it is true that property assessments are done by the province and they go into the municipality, whereby the municipality derives its tax base so that it can provide the services to citizens of the municipality, like police, like fire, like engineering, like recreational services, like educational services, like infrastructure, streets, roads, sidewalks, lightings, the whole thing on which a budget is developed around, you know, and then that's not primarily the capital budget, but then the operating budget that has the employees who operate those kind of services to bring them in and so on, Mr. Speaker, is going to be affected by the minister's Bill 40. That is not to say that there isn't flexibility or there isn't room for movement with respect to setting the property tax rate. I do know that the minister of the day who's bringing this Bill 40 forward is also a former member of the Halifax Regional Municipality. And the minister is very much aware of how a municipality derives its taxes. You know, how it will affect business occupancy is another question. I also want to say that there's a move afront by the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities and the business community to get rid of the business occupancy tax. That in itself, Mr. Speaker, is a significant issue with respect to this bill. Because if in fact the assessments are going to have a significant effect upon the municipalities, then surely the removal of a business occupancy tax is going to have an equally significant effect upon those properties. So I can tell you, again and again and again, Nova Scotia property owners are extremely frustrated by the fact that they live on fixed incomes and don't see the wage increases to meet the demands of the increases in their property taxes based on the increases of their assessment. They cannot live that out forever, Mr. Speaker, and many of them are having a hard time now. And they cannot understand why levels of government, particularly the two levels of government that they rely upon to bring about progressive legislation that will in fact, make it beneficial for them to be able to continue to stay in their own homes and continue to be able to pass that home over to their family if they want, cannot understand why these levels of government, of all the levels of government, can't get their heads together and address this issue. I can assure you it's a matter, Mr. Speaker, of the meetings of the minds. Because if the meetings of the minds are there, the capabilities are there, and there is a solution to the particular problem. I was somewhat set back by the minister's, I believe, an analogy, or I should say yes, an analogy with respect to the properties. I think that he had indicated as an example, the minister's example, I should say, he had indicated that, you know, that if a property was assessed a value of $100,000, and the following year the property went to $150,000, that I believed, he said, the property owner would only see a 50% increase. Now, I believe that there's the argument of should that be 50% or 25% increase. I believe it's more likely to be a 25% increase. But by the same token, Mr. Speaker, herein lies the problem. We don't know what kind of an effect this kind of formula is going to have, and if it's the right formula. There needs to be a formula set out with respect to how the capping is going to work, how we're going to look at assessments, because, Mr. Speaker, we've tinkered with what is called the fair market value. We've actually tinkered with it. You know, one time I said in municipal government, and I thought that the market value or the assessed value was only 90% of the market value of the property. It's not true. The assessed value has to reflect the market value of the property. Now what's going to happen is that, in fact, the assessed value will no longer reflect the market value of the property with respect to that. There will be a cap on the assessed value of the property, and therefore will not reflect the true market value of that. I also have some difficulty on the length of time that this is going to have with respect to how long a person can own the property and when the property is sold, and how far it reverts back, if ever at all, to the new property owner, of bringing the tax up so that the municipality will have that revenue that it had missed for those number of years, that revenue coming into the municipal purse to hopefully offset any of the deficits that they might have had as a result of not being able to tax properties or not wanting to tax properties. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, and I know, that a municipality cannot place a budget that has a deficit, nor can the municipality place a budget that has a surplus. The municipality must place a budget that reflects the real cost in that given year of the operation of the municipality. That in itself poses a particular problem. There are members who deal with municipalities here in this legislative assembly, and they know that it's a matter of letting the viewers out there of Nova Scotia know, who are watching this legislative process, that the viewers of Nova Scotia need to know that finally the day has come when Bill 40 is before this legislature. The people of Nova Scotia need to know, too, that they can make presentation to Law Amendments Committee, not only municipalities, but they as individual property owners can make presentation to law amendments or be witnesses to law amendments with respect to how they view this bill. This bill, I would suspect, Mr. Speaker, will in fact take quite the ride at law amendments. From my understanding of reading the articles in the newspaper, not that I lend a whole lot of credence to a whole lot of it maybe, and I weigh it for its particular value, Mr. Speaker, as we all do, and most newsprint media, as well as electronic media, we weigh it for its particular value, but we need to know that those people, those Nova Scotians who today are sitting at home watching this legislative process need to know that they too can come down to law amendments and make presentation and tell the people at Law Amendments Committee the kind of effect that skyrocketing assessments have had on their properties. And not only on their properties, their communities. Because, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I was in, as I said earlier, I was in Sheet Harbor, and I listened to the residents in that community down the Eastern Shore speak about what effect non-resident ownership had on their properties. I have listened to some people from Bedeck. I have listened to people on the South Shore, and I've listened to residents on the North Shore as well, through Pictou, Cumberland, in that area as well, Mr. Speaker. And you know, and the community that you represent, the constituency that you represent,